I'm Grady Colleen in the CapeCod.com News Center, joined today by a special guest from the Hollywood sphere of Cape Cod. Do you mind just introducing yourself for our listeners?
Or reintroducing myself. I'm Casey Sherman, and I'm back here to share some more stories with you, Grady.
All right. So as well, you have a lot of productions that are going to the live theater sphere. You did Whitey Bulger earlier with your investigation into that, and now I know there's another one coming up in the spring. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about ongoing productions that you have, some of your involvement, and kind of like what the appeal is for you. And I know there's probably going to be more after that as well. So yeah, can you just tell us a little bit more about some of the live theater components?
Sure. Well, for me, there's nothing like sharing my true crime investigations in front of a live audience. I've done several theatrical productions at the Wilbur Theater in Boston. I'll be taking A Nightmare with Casey Sherman to the Wilbur Theater on March 26th, 2025. In 2023, I cast one of my dear friends and a fellow Barnstable High School alum, Neil McDonough, as Whitey Bulger, and it was an incredible experience to really show the Whitey Bulger story on stage in front of a sold-out room at the Wilbur, one of the most historic theaters in Boston. And I love that format where I'm bringing these stories that I've written, these stories that I've investigated, but I'm also sharing these stories with actors on stage. So, I've got several actors, primarily from the Cape Cod community, that I will be utilizing once again for A Nightmare with Casey Sherman, including, Christine Moan, Kevin Lassett, Steve Latimer, Keith Rosary. They're all Cape Cod actors, and they're all incredibly talented. And I always like to work with people that I know can really bring it in front of a live audience. And they're certainly going to be, re-examining the Boston Strangler case on stage, which I reinvestigated. We'll take a look at A Murder in Hollywood, which is about one of the most notorious crimes in Hollywood history. And then the third act will be a recreation of my most recent bestseller, Helltown, which is about a serial murder case in Provincetown in the 1960s. And I'll be walking the audience through my motivations to get involved with a story like that. Some of the, the dark, alleys that I had to really venture into. And then, as I said, bringing these actors on stage to perform dialogue and to showcase some characterizations that I might use for the feature adaptation of Helltown.
Mm-hmm. Now, we were talking a little bit off camera beforehand, and I found it really interesting. You mentioned, it's great to have immediate feedback when it's a live audience on what lines landed. I mean, in the case of if this was comedy, you could see if the joke laughed, essentially. But in this case, you're trying to maybe scare people.
You're trying to scare people. I also do sprinkle in some comedy because you do need a bit of levity in these theatricals. And plus, true crime is so absurd anyways that there are just naturally some bizarre, if not funny, moments during the show. But you're right, Grady, you get that instant feedback from the audience from something that maybe I'll write it in the script and I think it's going to kill in front of a live audience and it doesn't land. But there's another line of dialogue or something that I'm saying to the audience that really, creates either a gasp or a natural reaction. And I'll use that and then work that into, like I said, the theatrical or I should say the film version of Helltown as we kind of progress this story forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, as well, obviously, I want to chat a lot about Helltown upcoming. There's been a lot of production side stuff with turning that potentially, you mentioned off camera, but possibly going from a series to a theatrical feature. But before we got there, I wanted to ask a little bit, speaking of finding Whitey, we recently actually had the conviction of his murderer. So I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit how that was for you in terms of a follow-up. Does that kind of provide some level of closure, essentially? What were your thoughts when you heard about that news?
Well, it was interesting because the killer of Whitey Bulger had been in a bit of limbo in solitary confinement since the murder happened. So it's interesting that it has taken this long for Freddie Gius, is his name, to be charged with the crimes and then to be ultimately convicted or, offering up, his guilty plea in this case. And, people always ask me, what was the motivation behind Whitey Bulger's murder? And, myself and my partner in hunting Whitey, Dave Wedge, we're the only journalists who have corresponded with the killer, Freddie Gius. And he used to write us letters with rubber-tipped pencils from solitary confinement. And the reason why they only gave him rubber-tipped sharpest pencils is because they were in fear that he would either stick his own jugular or attack a guard. And, we, over the course of our correspondence, understood what his motivation was. It wasn't to silence Whitey and keep him from, giving out any more secrets that he may have had. He'd already spilled his guts many times. So there was really nothing left for him to say. But Whitey Bulger had basically fingered a man for a wrongful conviction, a man, Freddie Weichel, who had served 30 years in prison before ultimately being released. Well, during those 30 years, he was a cellmate and close friend to the killer Freddie Gius. So this was just eye for an eye, old-fashioned mob vengeance and retribution at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. In your opinion, obviously Whitey Bulger, famous gangster for the local area, is that is with this murder and this conviction, is that the end of an era in terms of like America's gangster history, essentially?
Yeah, and I think America's certain fascination with gangsters. I mean, you go from Whitey Bulger to John Gotti, all the way back to Al Capone. There are all obviously many crime bosses out there across the United States, but they stay in the shadows. They don't have these oversized personalities and egos. And I think that, what lent itself to the fascination about Whitey Bulger was, one, he was able to co-opt the FBI for so long, but he was such an incredible, elusive personality. And that just, I think, feeds the fascination of the public. And you just don't see that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, similar to, this is very fantastical of an equation, but like Pirates, very romanticized at some point. And for America, that was the gangster for a while, the 1920s bootleggers and stuff like that. So it definitely seemed like that waned as the violence became more apparent, and even Whitey Bulger himself seemed like he had a interest in his own the ego related there. He'd been reported as going to see, I believe, The Godfather.
It was The Departed, which was a fictionalized version of his story, and the law enforcement officer who spotted him at a theater in San Diego is another Barnstable High School graduate, Richard Eaton. It's amazing how so many people, that I know were involved with that case originally, and he spotted Whitey at The Departed right after The Departed had come out. So, Whitey was always fascinated with how he was being perceived. But when we took Whitey Bulger to the stage at the Wilbur Theater, my job was to deconstruct the myth, was to show him as dark as he really was in real life. And it was, that's my job as a journalist and as a writer, is to take these, very romanticized ideas about criminals and then break them down to the reality. And oftentimes that reality is harsh and disgusting.
Mm-hmm. Casey, I do have, my next question is, what was in the water back then at Barnstable High School, and can I have some? It sounds like you've really been able to you've been able to stretch out, get your tendrils. A lot of people seem to be totally able to help out in assistance with this kind of Hollywood push that you've been doing, of course.
Yeah, there are so many you mentioned Barnstable High School, for example. Neil McDonough, myself. Mm-hmm. There's a director that I went to school with, Steve Kayak, who has a new Rock Hudson documentary that airs on HBO. And we were all, walking the halls of Barnstable High School at the same time. And we had great teachers. Alice Williams, for example, was my English teacher at Barnstable High School and really got me involved with narratives and, understanding Shakespeare as a 15-year-old, who was a movie buff at the time, but really getting back to the written word. And that really, I think, propelled me to kind of where I am today.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. I'm not surprised by the movie buff, actually, believe it or not.
Yeah.
But on to the next portion, Helltown. It is the story of Tony Costa murder in Provincetown a few decades back now, back during the hippie era. And so you turned that into a book, and now there's been production put behind it. You've been chatting with some major big league players in the Hollywood sphere. Do you mind just kind of giving us a quick update of where that has been as of late, kind of what the plans are going forward?
So it's interesting. I think the strikes in Hollywood, the talent strike and the writer's strike, kind of brought a lot of these productions back to square one. We had originally had a deal with Amazon to produce a limited series based on Helltown, starring Oscar Isaac as Kurt Vonnegut, who is really the so-called crime reporter that investigated these crimes while he was grappling with his epic book, Slaughterhouse-Five. I had Ed Berger, who is an incredible Oscar-winning director, attached to direct and team down Robert Downey Jr.'s production company attached to produce. Once the strikes, finalized, we pivoted away from limited series and now are focused on a feature. I always thought of this project or my book as a really kind of a 2.5 hour movie that an audience can see in the theaters as opposed to a limited series that you may binge on during a weekend. I love that idea of, having a collective audience. Goes back to the theatrical experience where you've got people in the audience who are gasping, who are, frightened. And I think that, really lends itself to the, experience of watching something like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. So as well, I was wondering how the production value might be going in of the ways that you're going to be incorporating that live component to begin with. So do you find yourself like certain characters might get like maybe raised up or shrunk back down, depending? Obviously, 2.5 hours is a bit of a tighter time period. It's probably longer than you have for the stage show, though.
Sure. Oh yeah, it definitely is, and I think that again, you get that instant feedback from the audience. So I've got a number of different characters that I'll be bringing to the stage for Helltown during that performance, and I want to see which characters really pop. Mm-hmm. Which characters do I need to really invest more in as we continue to develop the feature film? Obviously, you're going to have Tony Costa. Obviously, you're going to have Kurt Vonnegut and even Norman Mailer. Tom Gunnery, who was a state police investigator who really, foiled Tony Costa's attempts to stay free. And, he was a Centerville resident for years before I met him. And I'm really kind of investing a lot in him in the stage show because the audience needs somebody to cheer for. They know the killer is there, but who is going to be that, person that is counteracting all of the killer's next moves? And hopefully that'll be, state police detective Tom Gunnery in the film.
Mm-hmm. Now, as well, so obviously a lot of this plays off of some local authors, Kurt Vonnegut. So it's interesting. You don't really. He's not really like your hero character, quote unquote, because we chatted a bit before about this, and the authors that you have in that are kind of these morally gray forces. Obviously, these are real people, so I don't want to talk about them in a purely fictional sense. But can you talk about kind of like the arts, the writing, the authors, what you're kind of exploring through Kurt Vonnegut, or what you kind of discovered, really?
Well, that was really my fascination with the case. There had been another book written about the Tony Costa case back in the 1980s. It's a good procedural book. I didn't want to ever go over somebody's old work, no matter how well it was done. So I looked at, I found out that there were two writers at opposite ends of their own careers, hyper leaning in and hyper focused on this case at the time. You mentioned Norman Mailer. Norman Mailer would later fictionalize the Costa case into a book and film that he titled Tough Guys Don't Dance. And then you have Kurt Vonnegut, who was writing a story for Life magazine. Kurt had claimed that his daughter Edie, who was a student at Barnstable High School at the time, knew Tony Costa and some of the young hippies that were surrounding Tony Costa at the time in 1969. So, Helltown is really about the dark journey that two authors find themselves on as they, continue to get enveloped by this very disturbing serial murder case. And so that was the way that I was able to kind of shift the angle to the story, make it something that I was more interested in writing at the time, because the details of the Costa murders in 1968 and 69 are probably the most horrific that I've ever covered in my 25 years as an investigative journalist. I've covered well over 150 homicides. I've never seen anything this brutal in my entire life. And I've read over every crime scene document. I've looked over every crime scene photo, autopsy photo. And when I was writing the book, I'd go to sleep at night and my wife would wake me up because I was screaming. And she would say, okay, you need to take a week away from this book because it's affecting you. And I told her, I said, well, if it doesn't affect me, then I'm not going to really be able to articulate this story well enough for the readers to go on this journey with me.
Mm-hmm. A very immersive experience. I mean, I've read the book as well, and I was interested in seeing at what point, you obviously discovered this during the pandemic, but I mean, since then we've had like the Lady of the Dunes, and with Tony Costa, it seems like Cape Cod actually has a lot more of an exciting Outer Cape, shall we say, nightlife than I was aware of before. Were you learning this as well as you were going through?
Well, I mean, growing up here on the Cape, I know that in the winter months, the kind of the Cape reverts back to kind of spooky town, and there are all these stories of, Cape Cod lore that you can fall, victim to. Again, you mentioned Lady of the Dunes. I can give you the Crystal Worthington case and so many other fascinating true crime tales that have happened, here on Cape Cod. And it's just racking focus and focusing on them. And I'd heard the Tony Costa story growing up. He was the boogeyman every time I went out on Halloween with my buddies, but I didn't realize how dark and disturbing the crimes were. But again, you mentioned the pandemic. I was driving with my brother Todd Sherman out to Provincetown, and we're down Commercial Street in the height of the summer, and every store was shuttered, and it was eerie to see that. And we started to talk about the ghosts, real and imagined, on the Cape, and we began to talk about Tony Costa. And then I went back to my writing lab, and I started to look at this case, and I thought, okay, there's an incredible story to tell here.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Casey, for joining me for this conversation. It has been a pleasure as always.
Always a pleasure for me, Grady. Thank you so much.
I'm Grady Collane, and thank you for listening. I'm Grady Collane in the CapeCod.com News Center.